2, 1. Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the virtual Agile Shift. Before we start, I want to inform you about a feature in this presentation that'll help make the session a little more interactive. Please let me direct your attention to the question mark icon in the upper right of the presentation screen. If you click that icon, and it will open the question and answer chat. From there, you'll be able to send me any questions you have, and Dave will answer any that we have time for at the end of the session. Just as a reminder, you can enter your questions at any time as they occur to you during the course of the session. So with that said, let me introduce today's presenter. Dave West is the CEO of Scrum.org, and today he's going to share the future of work, the impact of Agile and Scrum on how the world works. Dave?
Thanks, Nat. Hey, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm speaking to you from a little bit of a cloudy and wet, but quite hot Cape Cod, Massachusetts, just outside Boston. So apologies if you see people, walking by fishing rods or anything like that, or if one of my children come in having caught a crab or something and they want to show me instantly, but hopefully that won't distract you too much. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about work and the future of work. Originally, or maybe you saw it, this had the COVID age on the title, and I sort of took it off because I was sort of COVIDed out, I'll be honest, but I'll be talking a little bit about that as well. I mean, you can't help but talk a little bit about COVID-19 and the impact to how we're all working, how you're all working, and what does that really mean in this sort of agile, COVID, remote sort of world. But before I start, let me just say who Scrum.org is in case you don't know. How could you? Where have you been? If you're in the Scrum Agile community, hopefully you've heard of us. I'm the CEO. I run Scrum.org. For that gentleman over there, we have obviously a bald thing going on, Ken Schwaber, the creator, co-creator of Scrum, along with Jeff. And we do training, certification. We have the 340 trainers around the world. As you can imagine, we've gone from in-person training to virtual training in the last I guess 20 weeks or so, which has been a little bit crazy. So I apologize if I look a little bit worn out. And then we have a professional training network, the partners that host these trainings, of which Improving obviously is one, and a real pivotal one to our story. You know who we are. We do training, we do certification, we sort of manage the body of knowledge around Scrum. So if this was last year, now, I can see many of you are going, oh my God, I wish it was. No, we have to move forward. 2021 is going to be an awesome year, I promise. But if this was last year, I'd be talking about how everybody needs to be agile, right? The reality of the world that we live in, and there's so many changes, etc. When Amazon said it was going to go into the pharmaceutical business or the drug I guess delivery business, everybody was like, oh my God, and CVS and Walgreens stock hit an all-time low. GE, that powerhouse of industrial age, stock is trading under $10. Actually, it's trading a little bit more at the moment. Well, not today, been a bit of a disastrous day. Sears closing, and then even Facebook, the sort of like the poster child of the digital age, has had it sort of had to go to see the headmaster in Congress and get a bit of a serious talking to, and obviously during that proved that the CEO of Facebook is not actually human. He might be a robot, but Zuckerberg. But anyway, the point is that I would be talking about the world continuously changing. But I don't need to do that anymore because we've got COVID-19. If anybody can see, if anything or situation can emphasize the need for this sort of like ever so changing world, then I think COVID-19 is it. We've been impacted by a virus that has spread throughout the globe, has undermined how we work, how we go to the pub, how we watch soccer, or as we call it in England, football, because we use our feet. All of those things have fundamentally changed. And our organizations are rapidly trying to understand what it means to their products, what it means to their supply chains, what it means to their employees, what it means to the environments that they're in, what it means to, it's just like crazy times, right? Now, you could argue that this has been predicted. There's a gentleman called Thomas Friedman, The World is Flat, wrote a book called Thank You for Being Late. which isn't about being late, but we'll ignore that for a moment. And he talks about these three things: the market, globalization. Now, we are seeing globalization on an extreme level. The fact that I can't get my children on the first week of lockdown broke, as in trod on, destroyed their Nintendo Switch. Do you know how hard it is to get a Nintendo Switch at the moment? And how challenging it is to have two children that rely on it because their parents are busy? No, because it's a fundamental part of their education system. The globalization, the fact that the supply chains have been broken because of COVID, the fact I can't send my dad and my mum birthday cards and Father's Day cards. It's crazy. You know, I think we now understand how connected we are. We now understand the impact of Mother Nature. You could argue that COVID is I mean, I believe COVID is a product. COVID-19 is a product of Mother Nature. Some people don't, obviously, but you know. But the point is that we're in this situation where the world is changing and the threats are continuously changing. The more people on the planet, the more changes to our environment. The impact is just incredible. You know, a large petrochemical company recently, their CEO published something that talked very clearly about the future of their organization and how environment, globalization, agility is at the heart of it. And then, of course, we see this continuous exponential growth of computing power, which is giving us both opportunities. You look at how organizations, pharmaceutical organizations, are dealing with COVID in terms of a vaccine and treatments, massive amount of data analytics happening, massive change, you know, big data analytics. Ever so interesting, the opportunities that computing can do to solve this particular problem that Mother Nature provided. The bottom line is we're in this very complicated time. Now, the question is, and this is, you know, sort of the work of a lady that I follow, and then it got paraphrased by a very good friend of mine, Mick Curson at Tasktop. As we transition from one age to another age, are we in this turning point? Is COVID-19 illustrative or a part of this turning point in the digital age that we're in? Are we, you know, we sort of from this frenzy moment of financial investment, or, you know, around digital technologies and the poster childs of VC work, to this more systemic, it's just a natural part of every organization. Are we at that moment? And is that illustrative of the fact that how work is going to be happening, how all of us, are we going to go back to normal, or is this the new normal? And is agility and Scrum fundamentally part of it? Because what Khalida Perez talks about is these ages of transition. We went from just a revolution to the age of steam and railways, to the age of steel, and then England lost its, or the United Kingdom lost its control over it, and then we moved to the age of mass production. Welcome the US, and then the age of software and digital, again, still with the US. But what's interesting is, are we in this moment? Super interesting, because if we are, then not only does that mean that how we think about work, how we think about the products, how we think about the future of markets has changed, but also, hopefully, we're in this huge deployment age of a different way of working. The world is going to be significantly better in the same way as the golden age after the end of the Second World War, or the end of the end of the 40s and early 50s. The same that happened in 1895 when we had this progressive era across America, and it fundamentally changed everything. And the Victorian boom, which obviously most Englishmen, you know, love and say, yeah, hey, that's great. And you saw those crises before, right? Maybe COVID is part of that. Maybe not. Who knows? The world is a very complex place. So, though, assuming that we are in this age of digital, or assuming that you're in this age of digital, then that has some very difference. The age of mass production, the age of oil and mass production, and I appreciate that many of you in the Houston area, and obviously oil's a very important part of Houston. I'm not saying oil's going away. I'm just saying that this focus on mass production and oil being the sort of poster child of mass production, right, is changing, is evolving to this different age. So we're seeing these changes: long-term planning horizons, short-term investment planning. The fact that, you know, that Google only plan a year maximally, if that's such a phrase, and they continuously, it's like a VC sort of Shark Tank kind of model that they use for their investment horizons and planning. Short-term profit versus mission and impact. We see, particularly with millennials, that the mission and the impact is so important. We talk about efficiency and scarcity in this old way of thinking, and innovation and opportunity and abundance. A great example is how the Broad Institute dealt with COVID-19 testing. They literally sat down on a Monday morning, got a team together and said, let's solve this problem. And every opportunity, they just build a testing lab in the Broad Institute because they're good at genetics. They obviously map the human genome, right? They're good at that. They can do genetic testing at that sort of subatomic level, well, not subatomic, but that at that very small level. And they knew exactly, microscopic, I guess, level, and they knew exactly what they were doing. And they, in 5 days, rendered a testing lab. Interestingly, though, the healthcare system around them didn't know how to use them, which is probably illustrative of this sort of age of oil mass production trying to fit with this digital age. And they're like, whoa, have you been certified? How are we going to get paid? Where does the invoices go? You know, all of that stuff was definitely not working. Anyway, specialization of labor, cross-functional teams, process control versus self-organization. And the thing that's very important, the last one, is very, very important. This idea of the rise of the creator. This was actually talked about in another Thomas Friedman book called That Used to Be Used to Be Us, which talks about the demise of the American education system. It actually is a much more positive book than the title suggests. Anyway, but they talk about the fact that we need to build these creators, and whether it's STEM or STEAM as it's often talked about now, right? Whether it's the environment that they working with other people, solving problems, those sort of skills are crucial for our long term. And he coins the term creator as the sort of type of thing. So the rise of the creator, which is going to be so much more important than management. Now, I mean, that's true today in Silicon Valley. If I'm a full stack developer, I can earn like 40-50% more than my manager, which is kind of crazy, right? That's not how it works in America. That's not how it works in the industrial system, but that is the reality that we see. So the other thing about this is, this sort of, we've moved from a scarcity model to this abundance model. It's a very different way of thinking about work. It's a very different way of thinking about everything. The fact that the reality is that, I've got a website that well over 1 million people are coming to every month. And it's running on AWS. When COVID hit, the numbers actually went up. So we just spent more money on my credit card. Simple as that. And it runs as fast in India, we hope, as it runs here, which is crazy that we can do that. We live in a world of opportunity. And when we think about this, historically, we've thought about big is beautiful, structures, everything. Small and flexible is everything. This concept of, small organic kind of teams and teams of teams being aligned to customers, delivering value in a responsive way. And the best analogy is to think about industrial versus ecology and the environment. Those two things. Though when I look at that diagram, I always now think of COVID, which is probably a little scary. That's a great example of a very effective small thing, right? Seems to be doing very, very, very well. Anyway, so how do we navigate to this different way of working? And I'm going to talk a little bit about this because I'm going to talk really about the implications to the way we work. And you can see this, a lot of people talking about it already. I'm going to really bring up some of the ideas that we see at scrum.org and what we're seeing in the marketplace. I'm going to talk about some studies we did with McKinsey. I'm going to share some of the implications of those studies and really try to give you a flavor for where we're going and some of the characteristics of the work in the future. I'm not alone. There's a lot being written about this, and some of it is super interesting. Some of it's a little bit crazy, and maybe one day I'll write a book on it, which is kind of what I'm interested. So 2 views of the future that I just wanted to pull out. One, which is the Davos World Economic Forum, those people that meet in Switzerland once a year, and what they talk about the future of work. They talk about the types of people that'll be good at complex problem solving. The word complex is actually super important because one thing that we've learned as Scrum and Agile is we're building processes to support complexity. And that basically means we don't know what we know until we know we don't know it. So we have to assume that we're probably going to be wrong and do multiple learning we call them sprints, but you don't have to get that level of understanding. So that means the only way to solve complex problems is by an empirical process. The only way to solve it is by continuously inspecting and adapt based on some level of learning that we call transparency. Also, what's also interesting is, that it's about people. It's about people working together. It's about, therefore, EQ, or emotional intelligence. It's about cognitive flexibility, the ability to be flexible in how you approach work, how you approach others, and not to be stuck in your ways. That's what Davos said. And you can see all the other things they talk about. But ultimately, it's a very problem-centric, dare I say, creative activity that can work with others. Now, some of you may be thinking, so why is our education system built around individuals? You do team projects, but that's, and afterwards you always think, my God, why do I have to work with a team? And we don't actually help people work in teams when we're in education. Well, that's actually a really interesting point and something we need to address. In fact, there's Edu Scrum being practiced at the moment, particularly in Scandinavia and the Netherlands and parts of Benelux, where they're actually bringing Scrum into the classroom as a framework to help people actively think about how they're working. We work with a charity called Year Up that's trying to bridge the opportunity gap here at scrum.org. And what we work with them is they have made retrospective a fundamental part of their culture. So maybe that's starting to change, but it's super interesting. And then Singularity University. Now, obviously, these guys are a little bit crazy. They think the singularity is coming and the like, but they're also incredibly smart. So there's some things, agility, adaptability, entrepreneurship, curiosity, imagination, and critical. There's a bit of an overlap with all of these, right? We can see this sort of character, this flavor of the future. So what have we been thinking about? And I'm conscious of time. We've got a lot to cover. It's super interesting, and hopefully you're bearing with me as I whiz through these slides. I apologize if I get overly excited. I've been trapped in this room for like 300 years, it feels like, and drinking coffee, and occasionally my wife puts food under the door. So what have we been thinking about? Is there a certain type of person that naturally thrives in this agile, dynamic environment? And where does management in the organization fit? So I'm going to briefly try to cover these two huge topics, but hopefully they'll wet your whistle to the research and the ideas and the content that's coming out at scrum.org and organizations like improving a sort of shepherding into the world. Is there a certain type of person that thrives in this world? I think the answer is yes, and I'm not sure I am after the last few weeks of COVID-19 or last few months of, I'm not sure I am that person. I thought I was, but now I'm kind of wanting lots of order and structure in this chaos. And actually there's a funny story I'll tell later about that. So, is there a certain type of person that fits in this complex world? Complex, probe, sense, respond. Emergent is the process, then best. There's no such thing as a best practice. The fact is the process will emerge, that how you approach these things will emerge, and it will continuously change. This is the Cynefin framework, or a version of it. It's kind of changed. So, Dave has definitely been changing it because he's super smart and always changing things. However, this is my view of it. And is there a certain person that fits into this world? So we did some research with McKinsey. Obviously, they're the kind of people that you want. They've got loads of data scientists and behavioral scientists and people that went to all sorts of super smart schools. So we worked with them on this. And the research focused on, interestingly, on three main things, really. We looked at personalities, traits, and work values. And we'll talk a little bit more what those two things mean in a second, that supported these three things. The ability to handle ambiguity. Now, I don't know about you, ladies and gentlemen, but over the last few weeks, months, since COVID, since March the 13th, when I was locked in this room, I've been finding my inability to plan ahead really exhausting. So maybe I'm seeing the ambiguity of the situation really challenging. But ultimately, I'm not sure I need people to be able to, what sort of characteristics can handle this ambiguity, and maybe COVID's an extreme, but that's a fundamental part of this agile sort of persona, as it were, this sort of role. The other thing that's interesting is what we've learned from Scrum and other agile approaches is that process is, it's important. It's definitely a sort of hygiene. You have to have process, but ultimately it's about outcomes. The only way to know if you've got it right is by delivering something and measuring its success, whether that's A/B testing, whether that's hypotheses and experiments. The work we do in professional Scrum for user experience, we worked with Jeff and Josh on Lean UX, and they taught us to reposition backlogs, not in terms of the work, particularly your product backlog, but the outcomes that we seek and how we would measure success. And then the sprint, you take those outcomes and you modify them to work out the work you need to move us towards that outcome, and that's what the sprint goal describes in its infinite sort of fashion. So outcomes, ambiguity, team. So the other thing that's very clear on all of this is that the only way to solve complex problems is to work as a team. When you go to a Broad Institute, or you go to our friends at CRISPR, or you go to Tesla, or you go to SpaceX, you see small teams of focused people solving these complex, multidiscipline, solving these complex problems. Really interesting. So they're the three things that we wanted to look at. But we looked at it for two roles or two types of people. We looked at it from the product owner, that business owner, that person that's deciding the value, the work that's being done, and then the people that are in teams. We didn't do it with Scrum Master, and the reason why we didn't do it with Scrum Master, even though that's crucial as well, is because we were working with Scrum Masters to help us do the research, because the process is incredibly complex. We had a very long, drawn-out survey process, and we needed them to help us do it. And if they were helping us do it, we thought that might influence it, so we ignored them. Maybe we shouldn't. Maybe we should do. And we only really did a PO, a proof of concept, an MVP on this research, but it was still super interesting, and I want to share it. Now, we took for the personality traits. So let's start with the personality traits. We took the 5, and we added one around ambiguity, because there was nothing that really satisfied that in the Ocean model or the 5-factor model. Now, this is a classic model that you would use, when you're trying to find the ideal husband or wife. It's the Cosmopolitan magazine or Vogue magazine. No, maybe not Vogue. Used to do this, when you stood in the went back in the day, we went to supermarkets to get our food, grocery stores to get our food. You'd stand and you'd read through it, and you'd quickly I'm a 6, I'm a 5. Oh, interestingly, I need to marry a sailor, or whatever came out of it. This is similar to that, and it's based on a lot of research and a lot of work. Anyway, so this is the big 5 plus 1, so there was 6. We built a series of surveys around this to find out who was more successful, what kind of personality landed itself. And we found, this is our findings: team members, product owners were our focus. No surprise, self-fulfilling, ambiguity was the most important one. Okay, that's so it sort of became a sort of moot point. Yeah, that's good. It sort of reinforced it. I'm going to come back to the other things. The other thing, extroversion, was interesting. We'd assumed that the only successful agile teams were full of a bunch of extroverts that like to play with Lego and run retrospectives. Turns out that's not true. Turns out it's not super important. You can have a team of introverts, that's fine. That's less important than some of the other stuff, like conscientiousness for the team, and also the sort of anti-pattern of, and we'll come back to, of neuroticism. I can't really say that very right. This fact that it's all about me, people are against me, all of that stuff. That's more important. We'll come back to openness in a minute, because anyway, we'll come back to that in a sec. What was super interesting was this. Now, I've lived in America 20 years, as you can tell from my accent. This is the original Boston accent, I like to think of it, maybe not. So I've always thought of agreeableness as not a good thing. He's a doormat, mate. He's walked over. That's what my gran used to say about, he's too agreeable. You need to, about my grandfather, who was one of the nicest and most amazing men ever. And my gran would always get grumpy with him because he was too nice, too trusting, too appreciative, too straightforward, cared about others more than himself. She goes, yeah, you need to step up for yourselves. That's why we're living in a council house, she'd say. What's interesting is, though, what we found over and over again from the research, and we did some interviews to sort of to add some context to this, was that the ability to be agreeable was super, super important. And what that highlighted was actually something that we also saw with, in other surveys, which is very annoying after you do loads of work on a survey, you do research, you get loads of data, and Google have already done it before you. That's sort of very annoying. So this project Aristotle, right? Yes, Aristotle, where they looked at high performance teams, and they found that psychological safety was the most important characteristic of all their highest performing teams. Ooh, no surprise there, really. We talk about this a lot with the Scrum values. We talk about this creating a safe environment so that transparency can happen, and where retrospective and improvement can happen. All of these things require trust. Now, interestingly, from a personality perspective, trust is delivered by being agreeable. Yes, and rather than yes, but. It's listening as much as it is talking. Now, personally, I'm like, oh my God, that sounds awful. But the reality is that you need to be very agreeable, not in terms of being a pushover, because that isn't what we're talking about, but in terms of listening and saying, yeah, that's really interesting. Why did you say that? Instead of doing what we naturally do is, no, I don't think you're right. I think we need to do this, 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 And now maybe over time you can morph into that, but at the start of any relationship, particularly agreeableness, becomes super, super important. It's interesting, tendency to be compassionate, cooperative, rather than suspicious and antagonistic. Now, I ask myself, and I spend a lot of time thinking, how can I be a better human being? Well, how can I be a better teammate? How can I be a better leader? And I think that those words, compassionate and cooperative, are super important. And sometimes we forget that because we're all about the next thing. Come on, let's focus. So we found that. We found agreeableness. Super interesting. And I'll just go back quickly to the openness. We don't know what happened here. Introspective, curious, and imaginative, insightful. We think that this type of openness is a different kind of openness from the inspection and adaptation through transparency kind of openness. Though you'd think that those things are important as well. So we need to do more research, and it's something that's on our backlog, which unfortunately, due to current circumstances, we haven't actually got to, which is unfortunate. Okay, so the other thing was about work values. Now, this was a little less interesting, I'll be honest. As you can see, we used actually a combination of models. And by the way, if you're really interested in this research, go to scrum.org, type in McKinsey, type in Agile personality, any of those words in our search, and you will find this page. If you can't find it, ping me, dave.west@scrum.org. I'm more than willing to help, or ping me on LinkedIn or whatever. Direct message me on Twitter. I don't know. We have so many ways of connecting now. Right? So you can see that pride in product, openness to change, customer centricity, self-transcendence, self-enhancement, and being, order, conservation or conservativeness. They're this model that we tested, and we found this data not actually massively super interesting, which was a bit disappointing. No surprise. One of the most important characteristics is pride in product. That's really interesting. And in fact, we now, as part of our interview techniques at scrum.org, we ask anybody that's trying to join scrum.org, we ask them, hey, tell me something you're proud of. It's a really nice interview discussion kind of thing, because it really illustrates, and you have to quickly say, apart from your family and your children, because everybody's like, I'm super proud of my kids, though having been trapped in the house with them for the last, 3 or 4 months, I'm not sure that's always true. frustrated sometimes, but obviously they're awesome. But yeah, so ask them about that pride in product. Openness to change, that's interesting as well. What we found was product owners need to have a vision and be less willing to compromise it. Now, that doesn't mean change at the micro level, how we do stuff, but it means what we're trying to achieve, even when we find it hard. Whereas team members need to be a lot more willing to that, because their day-to-day is delivering these, increments of change of the product, and then realizing that they're wrong. Oh my God, we didn't do this, or we missed this, etc. Customer centricity. I didn't like the result of this, and I'm disagreeing with it. But I think everybody has to be focused on the customer. However, it is super important that the Scrum, that the product owner and the person that's focused on that is super connected. That doesn't mean team members shouldn't. It's super valuable that they care deeply about customers. In fact, one of the tests that I always do when I'm doing when I go and visit customers or organizations doing Scrum is not only do I look at their Scrum board, I ask very clearly, where's your customer personas? Where is, who's the customer? And why is it not on the wall? Why are we not talking about it? Obviously now that would be in Confluence or something, but why are we not talking about it? Self-enhancement, conservative, obviously those two things, willing to try different stuff and willing to not be all about yourself, so team-centric. Transcendence is interesting because if you look at that, emphasize concern and welfare interest. So this was sort of less important for the product owner. Now, I didn't like that, and maybe we need to do some research on that, but they care less about their team and more about their product. The team seems to care more about the team and helping others and the like. I think we might want to restructure the survey a little bit so it's not just about themselves, but also, and it might also emphasize something in Scrum that worries me a little bit, that this separation of church and state with the product owner and the dev team sometimes makes the product owner less caring about the dev team, because ultimately they care about delivering value and the dev team can do whatever they need. I always worry a little bit about that. So that might be something, a bad thing about Scrum that we emphasize, etc. So what does that mean? Product owner versus team member. So pride in product, customer centricity, pride in product, openness to change. No real surprises there, right? But it's an important reminder, particularly this pride in product. If you look at the research at scrum.org on this, there's a sort of interview guide that we put together that might help you, I'm sure you're all super smart people, but might remind you to ask some of these questions in the interviews and discussions when you're trying to bring people into your Agile team or your Scrum team. Might be some things you start to look for. Or you may just decide to run this survey inside your own team and then highlight when we have difference of opinions and why things could be important or not important. It's a great opportunity, maybe as part of a retrospective, to think about the behaviors that we care about and the ones that we don't, and sort of just discuss it and learn something together. But we're not expecting everybody to be the same. Obviously, it's not 1984, really, or or figuratively. Isn't it crazy that George Orwell wrote a book about the future, and it was like, what's that, years ago, right? It was 30-something years ago, 36 years ago. We don't expect everybody to be the same, and that's the reason why I emphasize the fact that by using this sort of model and by thinking about these things and making them more, though I overuse the word transparent, to the team and to the people in the team, you can really start to understand maybe why some of the behaviors happen. Be transparent, be open about personalities and how that can cause issues on the team, and then let's, as a team, work out how we can make things work. We're not going to change people to be automatons, but what we can do is we can at least make these things transparent and think about them. And when we're hiring, we can highlight the things that are important. That doesn't mean you shouldn't bring in that amazing, data analyst or that amazing, product specialist or whatever. But what it does mean is you have to be mindful of what they'll bring when they bring their personality into that team and bring those work values into that team. Okay, So we talked a little bit about that. A little bit, and I'm rushing through the content, but hopefully you're finding this useful and valuable. So let's talk now a little bit about the role of management, the M word, right? Remember what we said at the start, we moved to this new age, management is no longer the center point, it is the creator. And it's interesting, when I moved to America 20 years ago, I remember going to my first party. I think it was a barbecue. I was living in Boulder, Colorado, so it was always sunny and everybody was always outside doing like 5,000-mile runs and the like. And I remember, in England, you go to the first question that somebody will ask you is, what football team do you support? Or do you like bitter or lager? And we'll talk about, English stuff, right? In America, very quickly somebody asks, what's your job? What level are you? Are you a VP? Are you a manager? Are you a director? That was a lot more important. And then where did you go to school? Which I was like, Huddersfield, and they were like, where's that? Is that near London? Anyway, but the point is that management used to be, aspiring to become a manager was everything, right? I actually see that differently now. I still think that many of the skills that you need to be a great manager are still very relevant today. However, the reality is that you're all part of this creation team, and it's your ability to be a creator that's crucial. This is just a sort of classic model, spending many years in the job, you get promoted, you then are responsible for others doing the work. After time, they prove you can play the political game, you get promoted to managers, slowly over time you get promoted higher and higher and higher until you retire. Sort of promoted into your level of incompetence was always the phrase that was used at when I was working at IBM. Don't know if that's true. Obviously, some awesome people at IBM, but it always made me really worried about getting promoted, that then I wouldn't be any good anymore at what I was doing. So I had to hoard knowledge and sort of be the go-to person and things like that. Well, that's all rubbish. It doesn't work anymore, because all the things that you learned when you were great at the job now are sort of irrelevant. Now you're a manager because the environment's changed. So instead, you have to think about your life differently. Team of creators with purpose. That's ultimately the role of management and leadership now, is to create an environment where creators can thrive. That environment we've learned by things like Dan Pink have the characteristics of autonomy, mastery, and purpose. That you create autonomy, you allow freedom. Now, autonomy doesn't mean allowing them to do anything they want, everybody to do anything they want. I can definitely speak of that with a 4-year-old and a 7-year-old at home. Autonomy means very clear boundaries, and sometimes that requires work to understand where those boundaries are. How many times you're in a meeting where somebody's done something, you say, well, why did you do that? Well, because we thought you said we had to do this, and we're like, no. And you getting that clear autonomy, clarity on autonomy is super important. If you follow Management 3.0, those awesome Jürgen Oppenheimer and those guys doing some amazing stuff, they have this great thing called it's like a poker game on autonomy, right? You play delegation poker. And delegation poker gives you a clear, you put lots of tasks and everybody plays their hand. You're like, what do you mean you haven't got control over this? Mastery, the classic example of mastery is how Spotify organized, right? Around this, yes, the work is done in tribes and squads, but supporting them is guilds and chapters that make you get promoted not by your contribution. This isn't totally true, by the way, but conceptually, not by your contribution to your tribe. That's where your bonus comes. That's how you're successful and pay the bill, but really get promoted for your support of helping others master the craft of whatever technique they're doing. And then the last one is purpose. And this is perhaps the most important thing. 1 and 3 are definitely the most important of any organization. Providing autonomy, but providing that in the context of a mission or a goal is super important. And then that allows us to clearly see if we're going in the right direction. One of the most important things you can do in any agile transformation is create alignment for your teams. And I don't mean alignment with the company and all that. I mean the outcomes, the customer, the purpose, the mission. If you can do that, then you get super success quite quickly. And the problem with scale, one of the biggest challenges with scale, is that it dare I say, dissolves the alignment and the importance and the value that you're doing. So you become a cog in a big machine. So you have to, and as a leaders, you have to spend an inordinate amount of time explaining why that cog's valuable and making sure it's the right cog in the right machine, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Super, super important. The other thing that's really, really interesting is customer business plus skills equals magic. So we talk a lot about pie shape, T shape, comb shaped, all of those kind of, you know, the sort of skills. But everybody, and this is why I didn't like some of the data we got in the earlier slide, so I ignored it and moved on quickly. And obviously it's the question I asked, but having that ownership of the customer, that context of the business is super important. Everybody owns that. The mission is owned by everybody. Now, to this mission, I bring some skills. Those skills might be back-end software development, front-end software development, you know, marketing specialism. Maybe if I'm working in the petrochemical world, it's all about geography and pipes and stuff like that. Things I have no idea. Or tax, if you're trying to move oil across state and country boundaries. Maybe that's my thing. But ultimately, I care about the mission. And sometimes I'm going to get out of my specialist area and do something that's not for that specialist area, because I'm going to help, because we need to storm on something. And I'm not going to be as good, I might not be as valuable, but I can help. And then maybe over time, leadership recognizes that we start expanding, and that's what the comb and pie, expanding specialist skills so that we pair and we share. So maybe we're not as productive in the short term as an individual, but over the long term, we transfer the skills on the team, so we start allowing us to be cross-functional and multifaceted, as it were. So that's interesting. The other thing that's interesting is this concept of people-centric, and I talked a bit about this. The separation of work management, tribe, the idea of I want to call them teams, squads. I know I have to call them squads, but Scrum teams, I would say that's originally what they were, and I want to still call them that. But this, you know, they're aligned to the work, they're aligned to the customer, they're all about that. But supporting them is this idea of community in the area of skill. So maybe I'm a tester and a member of the testing community of practice. So those 70% of my time is invested in my squad and my team, and I'm very much focused on trying to deliver value there. And sometimes I do some analysis, sometimes I even do some, you know, coding, or maybe I help package up demos and documentation. However, my love is my testing love. Oh, gosh, I'm not sure how that would be, but, you know, bear with me for a minute. And so that person is part of this community, and they spend 20, 30% of their time helping others, you know, get better at unit testing or system testing or integration testing or smoke testing or performance testing or whatever magical testing stuff. You know, that was magic that I wasn't particularly interested in myself as a software engineer back in the day, 30 years ago when I wrote code. But which showed why my code was rubbish. Anyway, so but the bottom line is I get promoted because I help others. So I grow in my skills, and I help others grow. And you know, the best way of learning is to try to teach somebody something, right? You're like, maybe I don't understand this quite as well. And an organization's responsibility is to create the space to allow that to happen. And that might mean that people don't deliver to their tribe, to their customer value stream quite as much, and that people have time to build and to develop the skills necessary to grow in talent and the like. So that skill-based community is crucial. So we need to build a skill-based community in every organization to support this, because our cross-functional teams are focused on the mission. They're focused on the customer. And yes, they'll pick up skills along the way because they have to, but ultimately you need an organization that supports them. Otherwise, you're just going to burn them out. And scaling is ultimately helping others to do this and to build those skills. And we instill a learning culture across the organization. And that means ultimately, if we build this people-centric organization, if we create these teams aligned to our customers, That means we're flipping organizations. So as a CEO of Scrum.org, don't quote me on this, I've got no idea what's happening, really. I have a vision. I know where I want to take the organization. I know what my dreams and aspirations for this mission and this mission-based organization are. But my job really is just to build an environment for my fabulous team and my professional Scrum trainers and my partners to deliver incredible value to their customers. And hopefully I can align that to the mission, and hopefully we can all move in the same direction. But my job is to create an environment where they thrive. They don't report to me. My employees, though they may report to me, ultimately I serve them. And that's hard, particularly when I like, being British, I like to be carried around in one of those sort of Roman things and have a crown and stuff. I think, and I was a little annoyed. I became a CEO and then realized that the world has flipped. I was at the bottom and I was like, I've got to get to the top, and now I'm at the top, and now I'm realizing that maybe the place to be is the bottom, with respect to these diagrams. Interesting. Leadership has to change. So it's more than just management. So this idea of becoming a manager, those skills are still important, but we have to build an environment that supports a more flexible, dynamic workforce. We need to focus on delivering value in a people-centric way. This is the 8 stances of the Scrum Master, but ultimately it means that I'm a change agent, I'm a servant, I'm an impediment remover when the teams are finding trouble. I help provide vision and direction, and I teach and I coach and I help. And then the other thing that's really interesting is, and part of me, if I want that agreeable, psychologically safe environment to be in the teams, because I know it's going to be successful, I have to follow my own lead on that. So this is a Buddhist quote: the thought manifests as the word. So psychological safety, we need to start using words. So yes and, not yes but. We couldn't say you're wrong. We need to say it's interesting. Can I learn? We need to approach things from a learning stance, because that will develop into a habit, and the habit hardens into a character, and then ultimately your organization becomes more psychologically safe, which then creates an environment where it's continuously improving, which then improves it, which then makes it even safer, which then delivers massive value. And yes, Scrum.org has this concept of the values: courage, focus, commitment, respect. I don't mind if you don't use those values. That's a good idea, maybe, if you want to use those as a start point. You have to work out what's relevant for you. But ultimately, if we can just start thinking about that psychological safety, building that learning environment, creating that mastery, autonomy, and purpose, then we can build an environment that's super successful. And we need to. The future of work is much more than, everybody being in the gig economy and all that. It's about changing organizations, models, and processes and technology to create an environment that allows us to be more agile. It makes us change what we think is important in terms of the personality traits that we historically have thrown into the world and said, this is awesome, we are man, me be successful, over everybody else. I'll hoard knowledge, I'll put people down to make myself look better, those sort of things. And I don't believe that people are actually like that. I think some of that is learnt behavior or what people think, and bullies win. I don't think so. I think that ultimately, if you want to build fabulous products that change the world, you need to create an environment that is the opposite of that. And organizations models need to support that. And leadership is hard in this new world. I spend a lot of time second guessing myself. I spend a lot of time looking at my own ego, my own sort of like insecurities, and wondering how to lead by example when sometimes I don't know what the best example is. It's not easy. So the only way you can deal with that is be authentic and ask those questions. And it works. Now, I'm from a little city. You'd call it a town probably. In Houston, it's sort of like, I don't know, 10% of the size of Houston with almost the same population. No, you've got a massive population. Leicester. I like to think of it as like Detroit without the musical fashion. Awesome food, red Leicester, cheese, The fattest man in England was from Leicester. His name was Daniel Lambert. Of the Space Museum, that's from Leicester. Great. Now, 2 years ago, 3 seasons ago, Leicester City won the Premier League. They won it totally against the odds. Now, my father is a season ticket holder of Leicester for the last 35 years. He's put £10 on Leicester to finish in the top third. When he retired a few years ago, he decided to stop doing that. Turns out 5,000 to 1, he would have won 5,000 to 1. And in England, you don't pay tax on winnings if you paid the tax when you put the money on. He's very annoyed. More importantly, his wife, Julie, is even more annoyed. But Leicester won the Premier League. Their market value was $23 million. Pounds, sorry, that was actually pounds. Man United didn't win, and their value was almost £200 million. So the bottom line is the story of Leicester City, which has been lots written about, is that they were working in a very complex environment. They had an inspirational product owner with a clear vision, but they had a team that cared about each other. If you see them, when Leicester won the Premier League, they cut to Jamie Vardy, his house, and he'd got everybody there. They were drinking, they were having a laugh. They cared about each other. Dare I say they loved each other? And they had a set of personalities that gelled really well. Now, some of that was pure chance, I would argue, but it demonstrates the fact that if you are successful with this, and if you think a little bit more mindfully about the teams that you're building and the organization that surrounds them, you can take a £23 million team and win the Premier League, the hardest, I would argue, league in the world. So I think we can do some amazing things if we do it right. Now, we've got about 9 minutes, I think, for questions. So Nate, you're probably sitting there listening to me waffling on there thinking, my God, he does go on a bit. Yeah, I do really. I'm trying to reduce the word count. Maybe we have some questions. Do we have any questions, Nathaniel?
We do have a few questions, Dave. So let's go ahead here. Has any research been completed that shows whether the physical distance separation of all the work from home has impacted the benefits that were touted around the face-to-face collaboration?
Okay, that's a really interesting question. So what is the impact of distributed teams? And has it undermined some of those things? Now, obviously the Agile the Agile community was very into co-located teams. It just makes life easier, right? A lot of the psychological safety is much easier when you're not down the other end of a Zoom call, right? You can see that. The reality is, though, that for many organizations, Agile teams have never been co-located. So for a long time, the dirty secret was, though often the Agile community talked about it as, oh, you don't want to do that. The reality was most organizations, when they were building teams that were amazing, had to take advantage of different geographies, etc. So the reality was always that. Now, since COVID-19 hit, we've all been forced to accept the truth. The reality is that distributed is a part. Now, there's a couple of interesting, so McKinsey's just done some interesting research on this, not about distributed teams, but about Agile in general, about organizations, how they can respond. The bottom line is co-location or distributed location doesn't fix many of the problems that are availing these teams anyway. So co-location, distributed in bad environments are still going to be bad. Now, what's interesting is the distributed teams are probably going to be far worse in those situations where you've got poor alignment, where you're in like 4,000 meetings a day, where you don't really know who your team is, where the measures aren't connected, where there's multiple conflicting priorities. All those things aren't going to fix that. Distributed or in person. The reality is you're still going to have a nightmare. However, what we've seen for good organizations that have managed to get with working well anyway, distributed hasn't actually undermined anything. In fact, it's made things sometimes better. Now, you might say, why? Well, one thing that's done is it's reminded us that everybody needs to be thought about. And it's sort of Scrum Masters and Agile coaches have suddenly been like given this sort of jolt of, ooh, like, and they've realized that things like liberating structures, breakout rooms, being mindful of the retrospective, just because people in the same room, you didn't care about those things. Now, because people are very conscious of it, because of distributed teams, because you can see everybody's face in front of you when they're looking at their phone during the daily scrum, it's really apparent. So actually, to some extent, it's actually got slightly better. Now, I don't know whether this is just a false sort of like moment, and it is hard. The Scrum Masters and Agile coaches, in fact, everybody in the team has to manage these things in a much, its cognitive load has increased significantly. And it is definitely hard, and you need to be mindful of that in your retrospectives. But ultimately, what we've seen, particularly as we've got rid of sort of hybrid distributed and moved everybody distributed, is actually it's better. Now, is there any research? At the macro level, there's a lot of research. That sort of agile team, I'd point you at some of the McKinsey studies. Ping me if you want to know what that is. At the team level and agile at that team level, I don't know. There might be some. I can remember. I actually don't know. I'm sorry. But if you ping me, dave.west@scrum.org, we can maybe find some together and see if it's any good. And it's definitely something we should be spending some time in the agile community. Hopefully that answered your question. Nate, have we got any more questions?
Yes, I think we can fit one more in here. Your study showing the difference in focus between the team and the product owner is very interesting. I've actually seen in us versus them scenarios in the work environment. What are your thoughts on resolving this anti-collaborative environment?
Yeah, I hear you. So that one of the biggest weaknesses, I think, in Scrum, and the Scrum Guide emphasizes this, is and by the way, don't quote me if Ken asks you, I did not say this. It's awesome and a brilliant process. But one of the biggest weaknesses, I think, is this concept of development team and product owner. I would like us all to be working together. And yes, the product owner brings different skills to it, but that's true of many development team members, right? And is ultimately accountable for delivering value, whereas the Scrum team the development team is responsible for delivering that value, the sort of delivering the increment as opposed to deciding what's in the increment, those two things. That tension is valuable, but it shouldn't be an us versus them tension. It should be we're in this together to deliver the most amazing stuff to customers. And we're in it together. Now, I've made some decisions as the product owner on what I consider most value. I'm going to listen to you, but somebody's got to make a decision. So I've made that decision. You may not always agree with it, but you're going to, and so what I see, the best teams are ones where there isn't that us versus them, and that they invest a significant amount of time and effort to get rid of that. And that means that product owner comes to the daily. Product owner is part of the team when they go out for pizza. Product owner doesn't like says value, team says, no, we can't estimate that, lots of tension. We collaborate on delivering value. And ultimately the Scrum team is accountable for amazing that customer and changing the world. And hopefully that answers your question. So I can see why that happens. Hopefully it won't happen, and you need to put some effort in fixing it.
Awesome, Dave. Dave, thank you so much for sharing and answering our questions. And thank you all for attending today's session. We would actually love your feedback. You can complete a survey for the session by logging into sketch.com, locating the session, and then clicking the feedback survey button. If you go back there tomorrow, the recording will be available from the video stream button. We hope you all enjoy the rest of the Agile Shift and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody. I really appreciate you taking the time in these very strange times. So stay sane, stay happy, and I look forward to speaking to you all soon at maybe a face-to-face event. Fingers crossed, eh?